I think we're all good to get started tonight. Thank you for joining us all. I'm Susanna. I'm one of the cataloguers here at Peter Harrington who has put together the catalogue that we're using as a jumping off point for tonight's discussion. And we're excited to be hosting this webinar with 4 wonderful panelists. Just to give an overview of tonight's proceedings while we wait for everyone to join and log in. We're going to introduce everyone here tonight and then run through some of the topics that we're hoping to cover on a sort of whistle-stop tour of occult books. And then at the end, there's going to be a chance for everyone watching to put their questions to the panel. So that's going to be about 15 minutes at the end from about 7:45. So we'll open the Q&A function on Zoom at that point. So save up any questions you have for then. So I'm really excited to introduce our panelists. We've got Dr. Jenny Butler, folklorist and leading authority on the academic study of contemporary paganism, especially in the Irish context. We've got Kristen Sully, scholar and author of several works on witches in history and pop culture and politics. Mark Norman, folklorist, curator of the Folklore Library and Archive, and the host of the wonderful Folklore podcast. And Dr. Georgia Van Ralt, academic, occultist, initiatrix, specializing in 20th century occult fiction, gender and sexuality in the esoteric movement, and a special research history on Dial Fortune, who we will be discussing later. So hello everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight. I think if we go through some of the topics, we're going to be using some of the books, as I said, that were in the catalogue, and we're going to be starting with some of the earlier texts on witchcraft and witch hunting and the impact that studies of witchcraft have had on sort of more modern paganism and witchcraft as it's practiced today. And then looking at some of the books from the occult revival and how that has played into the movement. We're going to be looking at fairy realms and other realms and how Victorian interest in contacting those realms has played out, looking at seances and the spiritualist movement, and then the theosophical movement and how those all interacted. Then also going to be looking at some of the art that has come out of these movements, looking at Austin Osman Spare and Ethel Rossignol, Ethel Cocoon, so some discussion there. And then finally moving on to modern interest in all of these and why we collect these books and why it's important, and looking at the sort of modern context for all of this. So I think might as well just dive straight in if everyone's ready. And going to turn to Kristen first. Opening discussion with some of the early works, as I said, Jean Baudin, Matthew Hale, Reginald Scott, different works on witches and witch hunting, and looking at their impact on everything that sort of happened since the 15th century. So I was wondering if you could kick us off with some thoughts on that area, if you.
Yes, easy to do in just 5 minutes, right? But in the case of Baudin and Scott, particularly, we wouldn't know as much as we do about early modern folk magic and divination and so-called witchcraft practices without their writings, even though they were writing at complete cross purposes. You know, Jean Baudin, he published on the demon mania of witches in 1580. He's a French Catholic demonologist, lawyer, and following in the footsteps of Heinrich Kramer and these sort of, and the Malleus Maleficarum a century before, with this very lurid, highly sexual, misogynistic take on witches and witches' Sabbaths and magical flight. And he goes into great detail, you know, what happens at the Sabbath, what kind of sex they have with the devil, like, you know, down to what does the devil's semen feel like? I mean, sorry, I'm getting there so early in this webinar, but, you know, great detail in that way. The most widely read demonologist of the early modern era. So obviously that impacts the way we see the super sexual charged witch and the imagery and the art that, you know, that comes out of that. And then on the other hand, you have Reginald Scott, who's writing 4 years later in the work you have, The Discovery of Witches. And he is an English parliamentarian, Calvinist, and a radical skeptic. And he mentions Baudin about like 50 times in his work, calling him a witchmonger and other people like him, demonologists, and sort of blaming them for this witch hysteria, that's taking over in that time. And the ironic part, though, is that Scott, to refute all these cases of witchcraft and to say that, it's not real. And of course, it's almost like against his beliefs and what God does for the world and how God keeps order, because witches couldn't possibly be that powerful. God wouldn't, have that happen. But he puts these really detailed spells and charms and recipes for flying ointment, sort of like a how-to manual, in his discussion of how this is all totally false and unreal. And so, of course, he'd be rolling over in his grave that he's like today we're thinking of him in the same breath as Baudin, even though it was like, no. So, I know there's some other books in the catalog that are directly influenced by Scott's writings. And so much of the Grimoire tradition later draws on Scott. And I just had an anecdote when I was thinking about this question for the panel, that a couple of years ago, I was at a folk magic class, like for practitioners, and the person leading it was like, if you really want to like spice up your practice or add something new, you should really get the discovery of witches, which I just find that so funny. And, so that impact is still going today. I know people who still teach spell work and charms from this book. And we know Shakespeare was likely influenced by his writings as well. And I don't want to keep going, but should I get to Hale? Do I have a second to do Hale?
Please, yeah.
Because Hale was not really like known as writing on the occult very much. As far as I know, there was only one trial as a judge that he presided over, although he did sentence 2 women to death. But it was his decision to allow spectral evidence in that trial that then influenced the decision to allow spectral evidence in Salem, which is why Salem was so out of hand. And then more recently, not really related to the occult, Hale has sort of had this like renaissance in American news cycles because his writings on abortion were cited in the 2022 decision to overturn Roe v. Wade by the Supreme Court. So Hale is very impactful in a way today, maybe even more than the other two. But yeah, I think that's pretty much to say the 3 of them have had a huge impact.
That was an amazing summary.
Thank you. I tried to get it all in.
Yeah. Absolutely incredible summary of all of those 3 works in a very succinct way. I think we were going to move from there onto looking at the studies of, as you were saying, the different views on witchcraft and looking at what was going on there. And then we were talking about Margaret Murray and her works. We've got The God of the Witches in the catalogue, which came out in 1933. So I was wondering if, Georgia, maybe you could sort of cross over looking at the occult revival and the historical texts, and then how from these very early works on witchcraft, as we got into the 20th century, people writing about witches played into everything else as well.
It's interesting when I was thinking about this question, actually, my first thought was how little Dionne Fortune in particular ever talks about witches or witchcraft. She's writing in the same period as Murray, but her work is actually very, very careful not to talk about that form of magic, not to use the word witch and witchcraft. And I don't think she really does until Moon Magic, which is written in the late 40s, or published after her death. I was thinking about the connection between Murray and then the what you might call revival occultists, so Fortune and Crowley in particular, all working in similar themes and ideas in this period. But I do see that there's almost 2 different strands that come together at this point. So there's these histories of witchcraft, to whatever degree they are truly history or imagined history. And then there are these more revival occultists who are more fascinated with the Middle East, the ancient Middle East. And again, like, sorry, I'm just fascinated by this, even as I speak about it, the way that particularly in Fortune's work, like Mystical Kabbalah, you do see all of these different strands coming in. And I think in the 30s, you had this incredible space where, you know, post World War I, there was this new freedom in the magical market, particularly the magical publishing market, this hunger for different forms of spirituality, and a new sort of modernist understanding that you could quite freely combine a lot of these different strands in one's practice and one's writing.
Yeah, I think, Jenny, you're in Cairo right now, and I think one of the interesting things, obviously, Margaret Murray was Egyptologist before she moved on to some of the works that we're sort of talking about in this context. Is there anything you want to bring in, talking about yeah, all the different strands that play into this?
Yes, as Georgia mentioned there, that imagined histories. You know, this is one of the biggest impacts of Margaret Murray's work. So, you know, she was discredited, but just to give some context first, so for the time before she was discredited, she was a very well-established academic. She was an Egyptologist, and her work on Egypt and archaeology was widely acclaimed in academia, so much so that she had a nickname of the grand old woman of Egyptology. So she was also one of the first women academics to be so influential. So she was the first woman to be appointed as a lecturer in archaeology in Britain. She worked at University College London from 1898 until 1935, and then she became the president of the Folklore Society from 1953 to 1955, and this has always been kind of a contentious kind of strand of the history, you know, this relationship between the study of folklore and the study of witchcraft, specifically that it was Margaret Murray who was one of the presidents, but she published widely throughout her career, and then it was mainly on Egypt, and you know, she couldn't do field work then in Egypt because of World War I, so she started to write about other areas of culture that she was interested in. So she was interested in lots of ancient cultures, you know, folklore, rituals, festivals, all of that kind of area. And she became associated with what's known as the witch cult hypothesis. So cult in the sense of a veneration, you know, this kind of focus of worship, this sense of cult. So her theory was basically that she proposed, or she believed maybe, that there was an ancient form of religion that she called the old religion, or a fertility cult that, you know, existed since the Neolithic, and that this stretched right through time in the form of witchcraft, and that witchcraft was also or paganism generally was a continuing resistance to Christianity. She particularly wrote about Europe, the European context, and Christianity. So she was saying that there was an ancient or so-called old religion, and a new persecuting religion of Christianity, which had attempted to wipe out paganism, and that you know, she published a book called The Witch Cult in Western Europe in 1921, and she set out her ideas in that book. And she also wrote about things like child sacrifice, human sacrifice, and animal sacrifice. And she was saying that this was then exposed by the witch trials and the kind of wider persecution, as she saw it, of pagans. So she was, as far as the evidence goes, she didn't have a firm footing for making this claim. So, you know, when her work was analyzed by historians at the time, and also later on, they were saying that she had both misinterpreted the contemporary documents she was using, but she'd also perhaps intentionally kind of skewed or distorted some things. So that book I mentioned, The Witch Cult in Western Europe, in 1921, that was published by Oxford University Press. So that was an academic book and very influential. And then she published the same kinds of ideas in the book that you have in your catalogue, The God of the Witches, in 1933, where she kind of put forth she kind of put a more positive spin on it. So she cut out things about sacrifice, human sacrifice, animal sacrifice, and it had a more kind of a different tone to it, maybe, because this was for a general readership, and this was very impactful. So both of those books, the 1921 and the 1933 ones, they impacted widely, but in a very specific way. We know that Gerald Gardner, the founder of Wicca, was influenced by her theories. So he put her theory together with lots of things from folklore or popular practices like charms and cures, folk magic, as we might call it, and he mixed those together into something that was kind of put forward as a continuous religion. So we still see the influence of Murray's writings. She wrote a lot about the horned god as the focus of this witch cult, and we still see in Wicca today, there's the Lord and Lady, or the horned god, and he's a consort of the goddess. So these symbols, these motifs, are very familiar in Wiccan ritual and artwork, pagan artwork, contemporary pagan artwork. Generally, we would see these ideas still coming through, and also that general idea that the witch trials were something that came from the persecution of pagans. But of course, we know, as historians and people generally know as well, that these people were not witches. They were accused witches, so they weren't. In the majority, they were not practicing witches as Wiccans would be. They wouldn't have self-identified as witches. She also wrote, Margaret Murray also wrote about ritual groups of witches meeting in covens of 13 members or worshippers, and she wrote about the festivals as the Sabbaths. So that word Sabbath being taken from Judaism. And this came into Wicca and other forms of pagan witchcraft as Sabbath without the H on the end. So the witch's Sabbath is another thing that's been very influenced by Murray. And just to mention quickly, she also wrote an entry for the 14th edition of Encyclopedia Britannica in 1929, where she summarized her theories on this witch cult, and she ignored other evidence, the writings of other historians, for example. She just ignored that. We know that she would have encountered their work. So she was selective in her presentation of this idea, and that Encyclopedia Britannica entry was accessible to the public, so that had a very wide influence. And Diane Fortune enthusiastically received this Encyclopedia Britannica entry as well as the books. And Murray had also written about secret society of esoteric practitioners who were witches. So there are many things in her work that really, influenced different new religious movements, different kind of strands or threads that we can see, especially Wicca. So yeah, it's and I've also, we also have the impact of her in academia, because of the kind of so-called insider-outsider debate, and just the fact that she was discredited as one of the first popularly known academics to look at these areas. So yeah, there's different impacts that we can identify.
It's probably worth saying as well, in terms of folklore, from what Jenny's just saying, that There is, of course, another problematic person within folklore who's represented in your catalogue as well, because you've got a copy of Fraser's Golden Bough, and we have similar problems with Fraser. Fraser makes some great leaps of faith, let's say, in some of the writings, and the impact of Fraser's work is probably similar to Murray's in that respect, I think.
It feels like every contemporary witchcraft practice book is also like apologizing for like past, either like I feel like every book I read is like, just so you know, I know the witch cult like hypothesis is not a thing, but like, can we use that, you know, the way we think about it, like emotionally to inform our practice or something? You know, I know Jenny wrote an article in The Nearest Kin of the Moon, and I feel like you referenced that a little bit, that idea of like practitioners, am I off here? Like using
No.
the idea of it, not like we know it's not historically correct, but can it influence us in other ways?
Yeah, exactly. It's like where practitioners will say, or the general discourse is, we know this is not the case, that it can't, you know, we can't trace this back through time, but at the same time they'll use the phrase the burning times,
Right?
you know, or like this persecution. Like you often see, especially on the internet, you'd see like 6 million witches. I mean, it wasn't,
Right.
there's no record of 6 million witches. It was 6 million Jews. You know, it's kind of yeah, it's as you said, Kristen, the emotional connection is something I would I've come across this a lot in interviewing pagans, where they talk about like people having dreams or some kind of experience where they connect with accused witches. But it's kind of like, it's both recognizing that they weren't witches in you know, they weren't practicing witchcraft or self-identifying as Wiccans or other pagan witches would be now, but at the same time it's kind of like they kind of were really, you know, in a spiritual way, because we're close to nature, or they knew about herbs or whatever. So yeah, it's an interesting one. It's like there's an awareness, but there's also there's still that subtle kind of framework of this being historically true. Yeah.
I wonder if we could turn to Mark now, just drawing on some of those ideas of sort of melting pot of that sort of like late Victorian, early 20th century, because there were members of the Folklore Society getting involved in sort of other esoteric movements, and the Society for Psychical Research and the Theosophical Society. All of the sort of same names come up in these different groups, and sort of everyone was very interested in many different threads. And I was wondering if you could speak more about what Jenny was saying about Margaret Murray moving into the folklore side of things, and then how that all functions when you're thinking about accessing these different realms and the different historical settings for it.
Yeah, it's interesting. The Victorian and the Edwardian period is a really important time in terms of folklore and folklore collecting, but also in terms of interpretation. So in the catalogue, you've got various examples looking at fairies, and that's a really good kind of jumping off space for this sort of thing. In particular, there are two items within the catalogue that are kind of important here. There's Robert Kirk's Secret Commonwealth, and there's a couple of the Cottingley Fairy photos, because fairies in terms of folklore, they're also a bit like Margaret Murray and Fraser. They're problematic as well in many ways, because if you look in the dictionary and you look up the definition of fairy, they'll normally say something about diminutive beings, magical beings, winged creatures, something like this. And all of these things are problematic in terms of folklore, because they're not that. And folklore usually defines fairies in terms of negatives. It defines fairies in terms of what they're not what they are. And what that does is it lets through these other definitions of things which aren't fairies at all. Because originally, fairy wasn't the thing, it wasn't the creature. Fairy was the realm, it was the other world, that was the important thing. And what makes fairies, the creatures, unique probably unique, yeah, I'll go with it, in terms of folklore, is that they live in communities, and most folkloric creatures, beings, supernatural beings, don't do this, with the possible exception of mermaids. So we can go with like Dr. Simon Young, who runs the Fairy Investigation Society and the Fairy Census. He describes fairy realm as being like the social supernatural, which means that we have a really intrinsic link with it as a social species ourselves, because we need fairies and fairies need us. So they need our food, they need our musicians, they need our children in some cases, but we need them to do things for us as well. So that's all well and good, but then times change and the Enlightenment comes along, and it kind of brings about an end to a lot of this supernatural belief. But in some parts, not as quickly as in others. So isolated rural communities have these beliefs that last a lot longer. And that's especially true in kind of Celtic places and that. So Kirk's Secret Commonwealth is really interesting because it captures this kind of rural belief very well. Robert Kirk himself is an interesting character. So he's a clergyman, but he's also apparently the seventh son, which means that if you go with these ideas within folklore, he has a then connection with the magical world. He writes this book in the late 1600s, The Secret Commonwealth, but it's probably not published at that point. He dies shortly afterwards, maybe, or maybe not, because there's also this suggestion from some that he's taken by the fairies and that he doesn't die at all. And he, in fact, it's said that he has to have the curse broken in order to either come back or to be laid to rest entirely. And that when he dies, his second wife is pregnant with their unborn child, who is then subsequently born. And the way that the curse is supposed to be broken is that his spirit is going to appear at the baptism of the child, and another person there has to hold an iron dagger or an iron sword over his head, and this will break the curse. And there is testimony from some quarters that say that indeed Kirk's spirit does appear at the baptism, but the person who's supposed to do this is so taken aback by this happening that he forgets to do it, and therefore the curse is not broken at all. So there's all this kind of really interesting sort of subtext about Kirk himself. But the book's not published, probably, and I say probably because Walter Scott publishes it then in 1815 with a short run of 100 copies. And Scott suggests that it was published with Robert Kirk's name on it in the late 1600s, but there's no evidence to be found of this. There's certainly no examples. And the text that Scott uses is one that's copied from a manuscript by Kirk's son. And then later on, at the other end of the 19th century, it's published again with a really long introduction. It's almost as long as the rest of the book, from Andrew Lang. He of all the fairy books of notoriety, and this is really interesting because it Lang's commentary on it draws these parallels as well then between what Kirk has talked about in terms of the fairy realm and the kind of work that's being undertaken, as you say, by the Society for Psychical Research and things like that. Now, in terms of folklore, and I'm sure Jenny will know where I'm coming from here, this is something that I bleat about endlessly when I give talks on this. So folklorists don't care about that sort of side that the SPR are looking at, because the SPR are looking at whether these things exist, whether they're real, whether they're provable. Folklore doesn't care about that. Folklore is interested in the narrative behind them, why these things are told in the way that they are, why stories are shaped. And the story of fairy is very much culturally shaped because it takes on aspects of the culture in which county or country in which the fairies are embedded, and therefore offers a commentary on the people there. So Kurt's work is really important from this kind of older lens, and people later on struggled to believe in fairies in many ways because it went against Christian teachings, and this is the lens that was used. And we get these different ideas. So Anna Eliza Bray talks about fairies being the souls of unbaptized children, for example, and these sorts of things. And we get the ideas that fairies are perhaps diminishing versions of older races, going back to, again, this problematic catch-all term of pagan, which can mean many things to many different people. But the other thing that's really important in the catalogue are the Cottingley photos, because the Cottingley fairy photos changed for the rest of time the way that people saw fairies. Because before the Cottingley photos, it was really only the Theosophist movement who saw fairies as something being akin to a kind of nature-based winged spirit. And it's at the time of the Cottingley photos that this idea of fairies being these diminutive, winged, Tinkerbell-esque creatures really takes hold, because the Theosophists are looking at the kind of spirit of plants, the vegetation angle for fairies, for example. So, you know, in all of that, in summary, what the fairies are and how they're represented through these kinds of examples in the catalogue, are they kind of a response to the progression of the world, industrialization, modern times. The fairies hark back to these kind of traditional times, and they kind of provide a response to it. And I wonder whether now, in this modern globalized world, that's what we're seeing again with the proliferation and the interest in modern fairy sightings, again serving as this kind of commentary on where we are in the world and actually where we all might like to be instead.
Thank you for that. Yeah, that's a really nice journey through using one of the books there. I was wondering, Jenny, if you wanted to add anything to that. It obviously touches on a lot of the areas of your research.
Yeah, as Mark mentioned there about the Enlightenment, you know, the whole backlash against belief and tradition. You know, that like if we think of the whole history of folklore collection, whether that's antiquarian collectors, you know, local kind of history enthusiasts, or when folklore starts to become an academic discipline, that whole like that early kind of stage was very it had already kind of separated out ideas according to this Enlightenment way of looking at things. So traditions generally in the world, I mean, this starts to kind of impact the whole world, that traditional, what were traditional indigenous knowledge systems start to be kind of picked apart really, and traditional methods are seen as being ignorant or outdated. Magic starts to be called superstition, whether that's ritual or whether it's what people understand about their environment. And then you get things like fairies, even the word fairy, won't go into what Mark has already mentioned some things about the term itself, but you have like, I'm mostly familiar with the Irish case, you know, you have native terms like she in Irish being translated then as fairy. It's not equivalent. But my point is that like things like magic, belief in spiritual beings that are not part of the Abrahamic religions start to be seen as something ignorant on the one hand, or something kind of scary that's maybe part of occult practices, you know, rituals that are secret and hidden. So you have those two kinds of diversions which then kind of meet again, because a lot of the folklorists, these early folklorists, were practicing occultists like William Butler Yeats, George Russell, Ella Young, and their contemporaries in Britain. So you had, like as Mark mentioned, the influence of Theosophy. Members of the Golden Dawn were collecting folklore, very interested in fairies. So you have all of these kind of the kind of context that happens in is really interesting, where you have that whole process of these things being seen as superstition or somehow backwards, and then the people interested in them coming mostly from an esoteric background. And with the Cottingley, we see this play out with the Cottingley photo case, Cottingley photographs, that Arthur Conan Doyle, with his esoteric interests and his maybe wish for this to be true, he was completely ridiculed for being duped by two schoolgirls, because these things had already been associated with silliness or something whimsical that only kind of flaky people believe in. And this then perpetuates through what comes to be called New Age, or it's still something said about contemporary pagans, or the stereotype of tree hugging hippies that believe in fairies in the trees, or whatever it might be. So there's a whole context for how that happens, and the esoteric and folklore, which are themselves kind of categories we've created, but those have always had a really interesting kind of interplay.
I was wondering, maybe jumping from that, the idea of how people are viewed who are studying these things and then also practicing them. If maybe pass to Georgia, some of the items in the catalogue, it's artists who were also called themselves spiritualists, and then the work that they did, they saw was coming from spirits, and it was either through automatic brewing or seances, and different art that they produced was not seen as sort of a valid art because it was done sort of under the influence, as it were, and then how that impacts scholarship as well, where if you're seen to be a practitioner, whether that devalues any of the work that you're doing, and then the attitudes that come from sort of external people to any of these studies. I was wondering if Georgia, you could talk on that a little bit in terms of your research and maybe some of the items in the catalogue.
And yeah, of course. I've been thinking about this a lot. I think there is certainly a kind of almost distaste that you find in academia, but also in the art and literary worlds, around artists and writers who go too far, who get too into it, who, as Jenny says, are fooled by the illusions of magic, and that these things, occultism in particular, but all forms of esotericism, are okay to dabble with for inspiration, but aren't okay to take too seriously. And I think it's interesting, particularly in the case of Spare, I don't feel like he wasn't willing to compromise on the magic for an artistic name within the insider sense. I think there is quite a clear reason that many of these real practitioner artists remain and have remained for a long time outsider artists, being a practitioner of occult and esoteric arts and taking that very seriously and not being willing to go, oh, maybe this is silly, oh, this is a dupe. It is quite a political and polemical place to be. And I think there has been since, sort of especially since the 20s and the modernist and surrealist movements growing, this tension between taking any of these practices too seriously and what that does to your art. I do also think that you can kind of trace in all of this quite a fear. Art and literature have initiatory properties. They can change the way we see things. They can introduce us into esotericism and the occult. And again, there seems to, I always see a sort of sense that as long as the author or the artist hasn't taken it too seriously, that this thing cannot therefore be too dangerous. But if they were deeply, deeply invested in what they were doing, that there's a possibility they might transmit that through their art, through their literature, and infect as it were, the people viewing it. And I think particularly when you think about Colquhoun and Spare, this sort of almost fear of what they were doing comes out even today in scholarship. I think in connection with this, sorry to sort of speak to some other items in the catalogue, I was very taken with quite how much fiction there was by practicing occultists. And it struck me, as it often does, that particularly in the sort of 30s through to the 60s, almost all of the big name occultists who were writing were also writing fiction. And that these figures really saw that there was something important in an artistic transmission, as well as a more sort of academic or non-fiction approach to these things. That there were elements to esoteric understandings that could only be transmitted through art or novels or poetry.
I wonder if now we can look at sort of the modern appeal, and sort of there's definitely been a rise of interest in this whole history and the general occult movements. I was wondering, maybe Kristen, if you could start, but if everyone wanted to, anything you wanted to add on that, and looking at why it's important to both collect and why people now are turning back to it.
I think living under late capitalism, epidemic of loneliness, environmental degradation, the rise of fascism, like people looking for community and answers outside the institutions they've been given, or, you know, mainstream religions. And there's so many avenues to explore within esotericism. But then I also think, has this always just been of interest? Like, I know we're always talking about occult revivals. Is there just always an occult revival happening? You know, I don't know. That's what I think when I hear that question at the bottom of it. Like, we're always in an occult revival.
I think that's a really interesting point, where people look at the ebbs and flows of interest in the occult, and then putting together the catalogue. It was sort of a very steady flow of writing across the different time periods, where the sort of disenchantment was obviously a really big thing that we haven't touched on, and then re-enchantment, and whether that had actually come and gone. If anyone wanted to jump in on that.
I would say that we're in occult revivals because we can be. I mean, there's still, like, in our cultural social context, it's, you know, we're in situations where the Catholic Church or other churches, the Abrahamic faiths, don't have that kind of oppressive power anymore. So people are free to be interested in these things, to write about these things, to paint paintings, have exhibitions on, use the word occult, have events on the occult, whatever it is. But I mean, in our world today, there are places where it's not safe. You know, people are still persecuted and murdered and tortured as accused witches, like Malawi, other parts of Africa, India. You know, so it's in some ways it's a contextual. The occult revivals are happening in the same countries and regions. But yeah, I think also what Kristen was saying, you know, the kind of that's kind of matched with the other kind of processes that are happening that allow people where it's okay to be a spiritual seeker. You know, that hasn't always been the case. People to explore other religions even, or other spiritual ways of being. I think those things are relatively new, or at least that people can be open about those things and have access to lots of different kinds of books and information.
I think that it's precisely what Jenny's saying, but that what these books that we've looked at today, these are where these developments have come from. And I think a lot of these authors were very aware that they were writing at the beginning of the new age. And it's interesting that we can now look and see the way that these books and these volumes have impacted the ability, the freedom that people now have, even the imaginal spaces that we can enter, the symbolic and imagined histories we have. So many of them stem from these books.
That's a really good point. I think it's now about 7:45. So if anyone watching would like to put their questions to the panel, please, there's a Q&A function on Zoom. Any and all questions, please send them our way. I can see one has come in already. So looking at, there's one that's come through that might pass your way, Mark, on rural folk practices in older traditions and how they become entwined with Christian practices and feast days, and sort of looking at that whole area there. If you wanted to take that.
It's a really important aspect in terms of folklore, the entwining of the two. That then it's difficult in many ways to separate them a lot of the time, because if you look at folk practices, they have prayer and Christian aspects enshrined with them. There are so many charms and things like this which you follow a folk practice to create a charm or whatever. And then you would use Christian prayer as part of the process of making that charm. And in fact, where I come from in the Southwest, there are many examples within folklore of what are termed conjuring parsons. So these are vicars of churches who are said to also be masters of the dark arts or to have their own occult library. It's interesting when you look at their stories from a folklorist perspective, because the stories are actually quite similar in many cases. So, a vicar breaks off preaching a sermon halfway through because he has to go home because he knows that one of his maids or servants has taken a book down from the library and is reading from it, and then some kind of chaos must be prevented. There's a great example where the maid conjures up a giant chicken, I think, in one which I particularly like. They're essentially, all of these, they're the sorcerer's apprentice when you look at the actual story behind it. But what they demonstrate is that there are these kind of intrinsic links between the church and folk medicine, folk healing, folk practices in that way. You look at many examples of cunning folk, wise women, cunning men, whichever terminology you want to use, from their practices, and they will be good God-fearing people at the same time.
Thank you very much. We've got one here that's come in. There's sort of two which are sort of connected, one sort of open to everyone in terms of if you could have an item from the catalogue on your bookshelf or wall, what would it be? And then someone else has asked about recommended reading to find out a bit more, and I thought if we could put those two together, sort of open the panel.
Well, I can say that I would take those loose leaves by Crowley on how to create a magical amulet, because that is truly fascinating. Or possibly the Ethel Colquhoun collection. Again, both of the several items of loose leaf archive material that are, really wonderful pieces.
I'd quite like the Cottingley fairy photographs, but they're not here.
I'd take the Discovery of Witches, probably. And there was a bat movie poster. Did I remember this correctly? But I really want it.
I'd find it very hard to choose. Any fairy related material I would like to have on my shelf. Also the Ethel Colquhoun, there's so much there, and she wrote about her visits to Ireland. So I'm always interested in those connections as well, anything to do with landscapes and experiences and so on. So I think it would take me a long time to decide if I only had to pick one thing.
Just looking at some of the other questions that have come in now. And one of them here is looking at the parallels or differences between historic folklore around fairies and modern accounts of alien sightings and abductions. Didn't know if anyone wanted to jump in with that.
I can, but if Jenny, you want to have a go?
I think there's time for both of us to say something, but just to quickly mention again about the perspectives of people collecting folklore. They were either occultists, I'm thinking of the Irish context especially, but if they weren't occultists, they were most likely Catholic in the Irish case. So and that goes also for like the compilation of what we call them like the early Irish literature or mythology, and this is similar in other cultural contexts where the material was of the mythology or the older religion or culture was compiled by Christian scribes. So I'm thinking of an account of the Tuatha De Danann, or the fairies as it's translated, arriving in Ireland on a mountain called Sliabh an Iran, and they're described as arriving in cloud ships. So some people interpret this now as being extraterrestrial beings landing from the sky. Whereas, you know, so there's some work being done on this now, and a whole movement, you know, where indigenous understandings are reframed, or possibly going back to their, who knows, this might have been the original meaning, we don't know. So it's very interesting. I'm personally interested in this intersection. Yeah. Mark, sorry, I didn't mean to take so long.
No, that's fine, no problem. Yes, there are obvious parallels, and again, it's this idea of cultural shifts feeding into the narrative of something that happens. So an abduction experience is something which a person undergoes, something generally happens to that person, or they are under the impression that something happens to them, depending on many factors. And what that actually is, culture of the time feeds into that. So we see then these parallels. So yes, there are examples of lost time because of being taken by the Fae. There are examples of the Fae traveling on discs of light. There are examples of people being abducted by both the Fae and by aliens in their experiences, reporting the same kind of smell, an earthy smell, sometimes a bit like cinnamon, and we find it in both sorts of cases. But we find this in other aspects of folklore too. So sleep paralysis lore is a great example of this. So you go back to medieval times, where people didn't have the medical knowledge to understand what was happening in sleep paralysis cases. Then the incubus and the succubus and demonic intervention and the sitting on the chest and so on is used as an explanation for a physical condition that isn't understood. Dr. Susan Blackmore's done a lot of work on the similarities between sleep paralysis examples and alien abduction examples in the same way. And we see exactly the same sorts of parallels again between things that people report when they undergo sleep paralysis or night terrors, and things that people undergo when they report alien abductions, and those two things being very similar.
I've got one here, which I think, Kristen, it might be sort of in your wheelhouse, looking at the appeal of some of these movements to women, looking at Margaret Murray's cult, and then going from there, and sort of what was appealing about the movement.
I mean, I think it's like twofold, right? Where it's sort of like, even though there is a horned god, it's sort of like a femme-centric, female-centric vision of, you know, unity before persecution by the patriarchal authority during the witch hunts, if we're to believe, you know, following Murray, that there was, you know, a codified religious or cult of people. And I think perhaps also Margaret Murray being female. I mean, that's got to have influenced, and you know, obviously we have Matilda Jocelyn Gage before, you know, a lot of first wave feminists take up the witch cult hypothesis, and then it sort of filters into the goddess movements. We're getting into like the 60s and 70s, and it's still there. And obviously feminism and witchcraft now, it's like the same word almost. I feel like, especially in the US and the communities I'm around, it's just a given now, you know, but obviously it wasn't always that way. And so, yeah, without Margaret Murray, who knows how that would have gone. So yeah, I think you can peel it apart and see some positive, because like, maybe you could call it like feminist world building. Maybe sometimes you have to build on some falsities when you don't know your history, you know, but I think it's good we're moving away from that. Like, we don't have to make it up. We can go with what we got now. But I think there was that, like, making things up when you don't know where you came from or what your, you know, what women in history were doing. That's my sort of general way I see it.
Yeah, there's, can I just quickly come in, because like there's imagined histories, and we know we can now identify those very easily. But there's also, you know, with the feminist movement and the overlap into the goddess movement as a spirituality, like there's also the real, like the things that we can say historically, archaeologically, whatever. There was, you know, there were goddesses. There are goddesses.
Yeah.
You know, this is not made up. So it's kind of like looking back from a very particular kind of patriarchal society that women are in, and looking back and saying, well, it wasn't always like this. You know, the goddess had a central focus before, so that's something that can be brought back and reinstated. You know, the period for the, you know, we can kind of, you know, forget this hopefully short time in human history that there was horrible domination, you know, that this will peter out and go back to like a goddess centered, or at least this equality. So I think in Wicca, you know, the horned god in some ways is not lesser, but he's the consort of the goddess. So the goddess is quite central. So there is a god and goddess, or, you know, male and female, without going into all of the other issues around gender that we could address. But like, it's drawing on something that is more concrete. You can point to archaeology or ancient monuments or whatever it is, and there's the goddesses, you know. So yeah,
like Margaret Murray's like ideological training wheels or something, and then like once you know I feel like the thinking got to a point where we looked to real archaeology and the real history that was happening, and you don't need Murray anymore, but it's almost like she filled a role at a time that helped people maybe get there, right?
Exactly. Yeah, you need someone to popularize these notions. Yeah. You know, and you know exactly what you're saying. Yeah, it's a way in, and people can then start researching what
right.
You know, where, you know, everything she said was not discredited. It was just this general kind of hypothesis. So I mean, there's always interesting information, historically factual information that people can learn about too. Yeah.
I think, unfortunately, I'm going to have to draw the discussion to a close here, because we've hit the hour mark. But obviously, we'd love to keep going with all the questions that have come in, and just keep the discussion going with our panelists. But I'm afraid have to call it a night now. I'd like to thank you to everyone for joining us and the questions and being here tonight, and then especially to our panelists for what has been a wonderful discussion touching on a lot of different areas. Really grateful for all of you for taking the time to be with us digitally here tonight, and everyone at Peter Harrington who's helped put this all together. So thank you to everyone for being here.
Thank you.
It's been great.
Susanna.